Today's talk is Europe and global governance. As Professor Eigengrin was suggesting, it is really to try and understand why the role of Europe in this crucial moment for global governance, when global governance, I claim, is really undergoing a deep reform, why Europe had played such a minor role. Indeed, the talk today is based on my book, on chapter 6 on my book, that, as the title suggests, claims that we have really moved to a new order, which is unsettled, but still an order. Now, this might seem a sort of obvious conclusion after the turmoil of the crisis and the rebalances in global power, global economic power. But it is by no means undisputed. You have quite a few distinguished scholars that claim that really nothing much has changed after the crisis. The status quo crisis is the title of a book by Erika Leiner, whereas other academics think that there is no order at all. My take instead that there has been a radical transformation with continuity, because there was no major institutional change like in Bretton Woods, with a host of new institutions being created, but the change was really radical. It was motivated by an upheaval in the power relations in the global economy, where we had the G7, which was at the core of the previous era in global governance, that lost in some 20 years the relative weight it took the century before to gain. And here the simple metric is the percentage of world GDP of the various group of countries. And really this chart shows how quick was this process, and also using quite standard projection shows that there is no turning back. Now, the reform in global governance was really a pervasive one, and indeed the book goes into the detail of why and how in the various areas where global governance is shaped, how the change took place. So we have 2 chapters devoted from the transformation from the G7 to G20, the IMF reform, the change in multilateral development banks, both with the rebalancing of power of the old multilateral development banks and the creation of 2 new ones, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Development Bank and the New Development Bank. Also, the international financial regulation changed quite drastically with the new powers as members of both the Financial Stability Board and the standard setting bodies, even though they continue, I claim, to be more rule takers than rule setters. Against the background of this radical and pervasive reform, Europe played a very weak role. And And in my talk, basically, I want to cover 3 aspects. First, explain a bit more how this external representation was really ineffective during this period. Then I will focus on three misconceptions that I believe are the root cause of such a lukewarm attitude to be diplomatic about a single European position in the global arena. And then just say a few words why the European decision making really doesn't help to foster the creation of a single external position for Europe. And finally, I will be contrarian with respect to the current mood and claim that Europe decline in the world arena is not inevitable. Now, Europe has really a long tradition of punching below its weight. And indeed, this comes from the Bretton Woods system, which was the economic embodiment of the post-World War II Pax Americana, where Europe accepted to have a passive role, both from a political economic from a political point of view and from an economic point of view. Indeed, Eikenberry defines this as a situation where the US power in Europe was an empire by invitation. And this fragmentation has really played out throughout the global governance, even though it changed quite drastically shape with the fall of the Bretton Woods system, the move to a G7 based governance. Yet there was no single position of the European countries. They had many seats. Sometimes in the G7 you had more Europeans around the table than other participants, given that the European Commission was involved in the G7 from the very beginning. So the G7 has never had 7 people around the table, but it had 8. And sometimes 9, because when the chair of the European Council was not one of the 4 G7 members, then a representative would also be invited. With the Treaty of Lisbon in 2007, things really changed, and there were major innovation in the EU external representation. And indeed, this paved the way to create a structure that, as I will argue later, an institutional structure which could allow for Europe to be more united and have a greater role in the world arena. And so there is an answer to the famous quip by Kissinger, "Who do I call when I want to call Europe?" And we'll see what this answer is. Now, there is a comment that I will keep very short, that one of the features of today's political debate is the notion that there is a kind of conflict between national identity and European identity, which I think is strongly misplaced. Because it is obvious that to be and have a united position, this requires relinquishing some national sovereignty, some decision-making power. But at the same time, this applies when all of us individually are members of a club or play a role in society and in life, and these multiple identities are not really in conflict, or perceived to be in conflict. Whereas now, instead, there seems to be a return to the polarization between national identity and European identity. Now, the first important point to have in mind is that really Europe missed crucial opportunities when this rebalancing of power took place. Mostly because it was not united, and it was really focused on its internal crisis that started with different views about the handling of the Greek bailing out of the support given to Greece, and then continue with really the European sovereignty crisis, where opinion differed massively, but in a way, even assuming this divergence of view, this should have not prevented from having a single and effective role on other issues. But sadly enough, and this I witnessed that personally, Europeans were unable to bridge their differences, and they only were focused on the way to address the European crisis, forgetting about everything else. And indeed, before the G20 meeting, there were coordination meetings among the European members and the European Union and the European Central Bank, with the idea to find a common position, which typically were these terms of reference negotiated with difficulty among the European members, but then at the meeting this compromise really evaporated because each European country made a point to expose the difference and really used the G7, the G20, the IMFC meetings as a way to just make a display of self-righteousness in the management of the European crisis. This was quite sad, and has really cut through this attitude all the important decisions that were being made at the time. There was the reshaping of the IMF governance with the quota negotiation, and there Europe had this paradox of having this huge influence in terms of both quota and shares, but really a very poor influence. The management of the IMF and the European crisis was really a disaster. Europeans managed to irritate both the IMF staff and the major players on this issue. There is a nice book by Randa Henning called Tangled Governance that make the explicit point that this divergence between European countries used the conflict between the IMF and the Commission as a way really to continue the tug of war in trying to define a compromise in Europe, not about external representation, but simply how to solve the European crisis. Why is this happening? And why for so long there is a tradition of being not really convinced that a single European position is in the national best interest? And I see three entrenched convictions that are just misconceptions that now have become even more popular than they were some years ago, and that I claim are really misconceptions that should be debunked really as the first act for Europe to be more effective in the global arena. The first one is the nationalism, and by there I want to mean the notion that European countries and many European citizens believe that the national country on their own can play an important role on their own in the global arena. And this I just believe is a sheer nonsense, given their relative economic size. It is true that their culture, their history has had the large countries playing a very important role, having empires, being global decision makers. But alas, for them this has long gone. Even though there seem to be many politicians and many people that still believe that, and indeed I regard this notion that the UK can play an important role on its own in the global arena as one of the key causes of Brexit, and it is summarized by the notion "take back control," but this is really in conflict with the decline in economic weight. The other story is that there are unbridgeable economic and cultural differences among countries. I mean, it is a kind of a common view very often in Europe that Germans and Italians are completely different. They have culture, they have a way of organizing the economy and the society. But once again, if one looks at these differences and compared with the differences between the European countries and the US or China or the other major economic blocs, really the differences are not that big. The final misconception is that there are conflicting economic interests in having a single European position, which is once again nonsense. Because if Europeans believe, as they've shown, they believe that competition is good among themselves. You have the single market. Then why it is a good thing to have a French and a German company competing with the Italian company to build a dam in the UK or in Italy, and if they do the same thing in China, this becomes a bad thing. Once again, it is myopia that has allowed China to play the divide et impera game on the agreements about bilateral agreements about investments, but without any real difference. And indeed, if we go back to the history of the representation of the different European countries in the G7, in the IMF, the truth of the matter is that there have never been a major contrasting economic interests. And if one looks at the track record of voting behavior of the European country in the IMF, the differences were either for trivial things like the salaries of the executive directors, or the only rift was serious rift was due to differences about the post-colonial attitude, with divergence of views about the IMF policy in Africa and the clash between Francophone and Anglophone Africa. The European decision-making does not help, because it is a complicated model. It is consistent. It defines three areas or three types of ways to address, to obtain, a single external position. And there is in the Treaty of Lisbon a painful and detailed listing of all the domains in economics and in politics that require one of the three models. One is the unconditional delegation model, where there is the European Commission that just negotiate, listening, but at the end the shots are called by Brussels, like in trade policy. There is a supervised delegation model where the position of national countries must be formally taken into account, and this is what is happening, for example, with the Brexit negotiation. And then you have a coordination model where national positions and a single European position must be coordinated, respecting a duty of loyal cooperation that is enshrined in the treaty. So, to come back to the famous question by Kissinger, who do I call when I want to call Europe? Well, the answer is it depends on the topic, on the forum where this issue would be discussed. But it is clear that this complex decision making reflects the kind of misconception that I was discussing before, and an inclination not to relinquish external representation. And this was, really very paradoxical at the very beginning of the introduction of the euro, when you had countries that had accepted to lose monetary independence, but then it was not clear who Mr. Euro was, because you had the European Commissioner, the governors of national central banks, the president of the ECB, in a cacophony of voice that certainly was an important element of the massive depreciation of the euro after its inception. Now, all of this situation shows that really Europe is being very weak, repeatedly very weak, and very weak for important and entrenched reasons, which, by the way, now seems to become even more popular and to get even more traction. So I, of course, do not live in La La Land, so I do understand what is happening. But the point that I want to make is that ideology and nationalism may, but need not prevail. And indeed, I suggest a simple step to start creating a single, stronger single external voice, having a single European representation in international financial institutions. By the way, this doesn't require no changes in legislation in the treaty. For a long time there's been a discussion about the single seat in the IMF board, with the red herring of the discussion whether the European as such, the the European Union as such could become a member of the IMF, which is clearly a non-started. What is really needed is to have the Europeans to play exactly the game that some of them do when in certain multilateral development banks, each of them has to find some partners to define a constituency and nominate one executive director. And this might appear something, again, utopian, but it has already taken place. And in the book I tell two stories about the single seat in Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I tell a story of a joint statement just in the middle of the European crisis, but it was a joint statement in the European directors within the Asian Development Bank that really was very useful in promoting the common European interest and finding a right balance with the US and the Japanese representation there. So it can be done, it has been done, and you simply need the political will to move a step in this direction. So you have recently had the Commission coming with a paper putting forward some steps to do that in quite legalistic and with a long time horizon. My take is that one with these sort of things should really have a just do it approach, and indeed this is what has happened in the negotiation for the representation of the Euro area in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now, my claim is that a more effective Europe in global governance is not only good for Europe, but is good for the world too. And this has, if you will, some very straightforward arguments. The first one is that clearly tripolar system is much more stable, also from a political point of view, than a dual system. There is an immense literature of American political scientists after the Second World War that were discussing there at the time. The other big pole was Russia, that really argue this quite convincingly. But also the quality of global governance would improve with a stronger Europe, because it could help disseminate features of the European social economic model that can help, let's use the word, tame globalization, make society more inclusive, and in this way diffuse the complaints about globalization. Clearly, as a part of this, a stronger Europe would also be very useful in helping a more balanced international financial architecture. And my take is that a stronger euro would, a stronger Europe, of course, not in the sense of its value, but its role in international finance, would help to unwind in an orderly fashion the huge stock disequilibrium that you have between the US and China. You have, all the story of SDR, the exorbitant privilege, all these things that are typically cast in terms of flows, where the real issue now, the worst threat to global stability in the financial is really in terms of stock. And the euro has indeed the potential to become a reserve currency, and just using Professor Eichengreen approach that calls contrast the Mercury versus Mars view of the reason why you have a reserve currency in the world, namely the trade invoicing aspect, the Mercury, or instead the Mars aspect being the political or military hegemony. My take there is that Mercury for the euro is in good part already there. Now Mars, in terms of single European defense policy, is quite difficult to think about as forthcoming, but at least we should have Europe and Irene holding hands. Irene was the Greek goddess for peace, so a bit of peace and strengthening of the European institution, I think, could be enough. So let me conclude recalling that there has been a very long tradition of ineffective external representation, and this is really reflecting the misconceived idea that European and national external interests differ. Europe, because of these misconceptions, has missed a crucial opportunity to shape the reform of global governance. And this has happened both in the informal groups, in the reshaping of competence and power between the G7 and the G20, in the IMF governance, in the role, in the changing role of multilateral development banks. The other strong point that I want to make is that this declining influence is not inevitable. You have to start to debunk these three misconceptions and then move with, and I suggest some highly symbolic step, like having single chair in international financial institutions and most importantly in the IMF. And as I said, this is not just wishful thinking. It can be done, it has been done. And finally, my take is that a stronger role for Europe in global governance would also be beneficial to the world prosperity. Thank you.